The morning sun cast long shadows across the twisted rubble and charred ground of Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort sat hunched at his desk, surrounded by towering stacks of intercepted Japanese messages. It was late April 1942, and the codebreaker hadn't been home to see his family in weeks. His uniform hung wrinkled on his frame. His eyes were red-rimmed from exhaustion, but his mind remained razor-sharp. Something massive was brewing. He could sense it in the patterns of enemy radio traffic, in the surge of coded communications flowing through Station Hypo like a gathering storm about to break free. Beyond his basement office, windowless, cramped, buried deep in the 14th Naval District building, the Pacific Fleet struggled in the shadow of catastrophe. 4 battleships rested on the harbor floor. Hundreds of aircraft lay destroyed. Over 2,000 American lives had been lost that terrible December morning. The Japanese had struck with devastating precision and overwhelming numbers, shattering America's Pacific defenses in hours. Yet Rochefort possessed knowledge the enemy lacked. The Americans were far from finished. They were learning, adjusting their tactics, and preparing to hit back harder than ever. "Sir, another intercept from the Japanese 4th Fleet," one of his team members announced, placing a freshly decoded message onto Rochefort's chaotic desk. The young officer's face bore the exhaustion of weeks spent cracking the enemy's naval code. "They're requesting additional supplies for something called Operation MI. Rochefort's weary eyes suddenly blazed with focus. For weeks now, his analysts had been assembling fragments of an enormous Japanese military plan. The enemy was preparing an operation that would make Pearl Harbor look minor by comparison. But where was it happening? When would they strike? The mysterious designation AF kept appearing in the intercepts, like a puzzle demanding to be solved. If they could decipher this code, they might reverse the entire course of the war. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood gazing from his headquarters window, watching salvage crews continuing their efforts to recover the sunken battleships below. The gray-haired Texan had assumed command of the Pacific Fleet during its most desperate moment, taking over a demoralized force facing an apparently unstoppable enemy. Behind him, his intelligence officer, Commander Edwin Layton, spoke carefully. "Admiral, Rochefort's team believes they've found a pattern in the enemy communications. They're reporting that something significant is being planned for early June. The scope indicates this will be their most ambitious operation since the fighting started." Nimitz turned away from the window, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Layton. The Admiral had learned to value his intelligence team's judgment, even when their assessments seemed improbable. Unlike many commanders who dismissed code-breaking as unreliable, Nimitz recognized that intelligence was the war's most lethal weapon. "How confident are they?" Nimitz asked, his tone carrying the gravity of command. Each choice he made held consequences. Thousands of sailors and Marines could live or die based on his decisions. "Rochefort would stake his career on it, sir," Layton answered without hesitation. "His team believes the target is somewhere in the Central Pacific. They're working continuously to pinpoint the exact location." Nimitz nodded deliberately. If Rochefort was correct, this offered exactly the chance they desperately required. The Japanese had been sweeping across the Pacific like an unstoppable wave, seizing island after island, establishing an empire stretching from their homeland toward Australia. But every expanding power eventually faced limits, and perhaps the enemy was finally pushing too far. Down in the cryptanalysis center, Rochefort's team labored with intense urgency. The basement workspace hung thick with smoke from cigarettes and the aroma of cold coffee. IBM tabulating machines hummed and clattered continuously, processing thousands upon thousands of code sequences. Officers in rumpled uniforms hunched over countless worksheets, searching relentlessly for meaningful patterns within the apparent chaos. "I've found something," called out Lieutenant Commander Wesley Hamright, one of Rochefort's most skilled cryptanalysts. "The Japanese keep mentioning water purification systems for AF. Why would they need special water equipment for a major naval base?" Rochefort's thoughts crystallized. A location requiring significant water supplies, somewhere crucial enough for such an enormous operation. His mind raced through options, and then recognition struck. It must be Midway Atoll, that small American installation protecting the route to Hawaii. One member of his team, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, proposed a brilliant solution. What if we have Midway report water problems? If the Japanese include it in their communications, we'll confirm AF is Midway. Get me a secure connection to Midway, Rochefort commanded. Tell them to send an unencrypted message about their water purification system failing. Meanwhile, aboard the carrier USS Enterprise, Admiral William Bull Halsey occupied his sickbay, his body ravaged by a debilitating skin condition. The aggressive tactician who had spearheaded the early carrier attacks on Japanese positions now found himself too weak to walk. His task force was preparing to enter the war's most crucial engagement, yet he would not be commanding it. "Bill, you look terrible," said Admiral Raymond Spruance, visiting his colleague. The two men contrasted sharply in personality. Halsey possessed boldness and quick instinct, while Spruance displayed calculation and methodical care, yet they held profound mutual respect and shared commitment to Japanese defeat. "Ray, I'm handing you my command," Halsey said weakly. "Take my sailors and strike those bastards with everything you have. They have faith in you, and so do I." Spruance accepted solemnly. He had never commanded carriers in battle previously, but his grasp of naval warfare principles surpassed nearly everyone's. Equally important, he possessed the capacity to listen to his captains and base choices on evidence rather than instinct. These capabilities would soon face unprecedented demands. On Midway itself, Marine Colonel Harold Shannon surveyed his makeshift air squadron. The atoll's air group was a motley collection of outdated Brewster Buffalo fighters, already proven inferior to the Japanese Zero, mixed with a few more modern Wildcat fighters and several bombers. His aviators were largely inexperienced, fresh from instruction with minimal combat backgrounds. "Colonel, are we supposed to defend against the Japanese Navy with these aircraft?" Major Lofton Henderson asked, pointing toward the lined-up Buffaloes. The Marine officer recognized these planes' notorious reputation, called flying coffins, by the men who flew them. "We'll either stop them or we'll die trying," Shannon answered grimly. "Every moment we buy them gives our Navy additional time to strike their carriers. That's our mission, Major. Fight with whatever we possess." Back at Pearl Harbor, urgent confirmation reached Rochefort's team. Japanese communications revealed in their coded messages that AF was facing water shortages. The location was absolutely Midway. With this essential intelligence confirmed, Nimitz assembled his senior commanders for an immediate conference. "Gentlemen, we know their destination and roughly when they're coming," Nimitz announced to the gathered officers. "The Japanese are sending at least 4 carriers to assault Midway next month. This is our moment to catch them." Captain Miles Browning, Halsey's former chief of staff now working under Spruance, reviewed the intelligence documents. "Sir, our pilots report at least 6 Japanese carriers operational. If they deploy all of them—" "They won't," Nimitz interrupted with steady assurance. "Our intelligence shows they're dividing their force. 2 carriers are heading toward the Aleutians as a distraction. That leaves 4 targeting Midway, and we'll have 3 ready and waiting." The numbers remained difficult. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were Pearl Harbor veterans with experience from Indian Ocean operations. Their pilots represented the world's finest, hardened by years of combat. The American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, had determined crews but considerably less experience. Furthermore, Yorktown had suffered serious damage at Coral Sea and was limping back to Pearl Harbor. "How long to get Yorktown fixed?" Nimitz questioned his maintenance chief. "Minimum 3 months, Admiral. She sustained significant bomb damage throughout her structure. The flight deck and fuel systems are severely damaged." "You have 3 days," Nimitz declared without wavering. "I want that carrier seaworthy and departing with the others, whatever it requires." The maintenance officer stared in shock but saw the resolve etched in Nimitz's face. "Yes, sir, we'll work round the clock." As May progressed, Pearl Harbor transformed into frenzied chaos. 1,400 workers descended on Yorktown, welding, riveting, and fitting new components. Repairs requiring months were squeezed into 72 hours of incredible labor. Men toiled until their bodies gave out, understanding that every weld they created, every plate they installed, might determine the difference between triumph and devastation. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, one of the Navy's most accomplished fighter aviators, gathered his pilots aboard Yorktown. He had created innovative strategies specifically designed to handle the superior turning capability of the Japanese Zero, which had dominated prior aerial fights. "Listen carefully," Thatch addressed his younger aviators. "The Zero outturns us, outclimbs us, and is faster, but it's lightly constructed. Our Wildcats can absorb damage and continue flying. We're going to use a formation I've developed called the Thatch Weave. We operate in pairs, protect each other, and never engage a Zero alone." Among the aviators was Ensign George Gay, recently graduated from flight training with only 300 flight hours. The young man from Texas attempted to mask his anxiety while Thatch outlined their strategy against the approaching Japanese. The torpedo bombers would approach from below, flying slowly, sitting ducks for enemy fighters and ship-mounted guns. Everyone grasped this was practically a death mission, yet nobody expressed doubt. In the intelligence operations, officers assembled the full picture of Japanese strength. They identified Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Pearl Harbor's originator, commanding personally. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had led at Pearl Harbor, commanded the strike force. The intelligence picture showed Japanese were convinced of their superiority. They were returning to complete what they had initiated half a year ago. "They're bringing enormous amounts," reported one of Nimitz's officers. "Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport vessels carrying invasion soldiers. They intend to seize Midway and launch additional operations toward Hawaii." "Let them come," Nimitz responded without emotion. "The bigger their fleet, the more they forfeit if we succeed." On May 28th, Task Force 16, built around Enterprise and Hornet under Spruance's authority, departed Pearl Harbor. The carriers moved behind a protective screen of cruisers and destroyers, all crews standing ready. 2 days afterward, on May 30th, Yorktown sailed behind them, her surfaces still showing fresh welding and patches. The trio would meet northeast of Midway at Point Luck, ideally situated to surprise the approaching enemies. Aboard Enterprise, Spruance examined current intelligence reports with his officers. The composed admiral possessed a brilliant analytical mind and careful methodology. Unlike the impetuous Halsey, Spruance weighed each decision, evaluating all angles before committing. "The Japanese anticipate surprising us," Spruance explained to his team. "They assume our carriers are scattered across the South Pacific or back in Pearl. Their confidence in our weakness represents our best advantage. We must capitalize on it wisely." Commander Wade McCluskey, directing Enterprise's air forces, readied his aviators for the upcoming challenge. A respected carrier pilot, McCluskey grasped both what his aircraft and personnel could accomplish and their shortcomings. "When we locate their carriers, we strike with maximum force," McCluskey instructed his squadron heads. "The bombers will descend from above, while the torpedo planes strike from below. Fighter protection will be limited, so speed and the element of surprise become vital." Among McCluskey's aviators stood Lieutenant Richard Dick Best, commanding the bombing squadron. Best possessed a reputation for extraordinary accuracy when dive bombing, an ability that would quickly become essential. He assembled his aviators for additional details. "Remember, we're seeking their carriers, not battleships or other vessels," Best reminded them. "I don't care what other targets tempt you. The fate of the entire war hung in the balance. To win this campaign, the Americans needed to sink the enemy carriers." As May shifted into June, both naval forces began closing in on what would become their monumental clash. The Americans possessed a critical advantage through their decryption efforts, yet intelligence alone wouldn't determine the outcome. This upcoming confrontation would hinge on pilot skill and bravery, commanding decisions made under crushing pressure, and the razor-thin margin separating triumph from catastrophe that defined carrier combat. On Midway itself, the tempo of preparations intensified dramatically. Aircraft stood fueled and armed, ready for immediate action. Marines carved out fortified positions in the rough coral sand. Radar operators maintained constant watch over the sky, understanding that their screens would deliver the first alarm when Japanese planes appeared. Though heavily outnumbered, the garrison grasped their crucial mission. They had to endure long enough for naval forces to strike the enemy carriers. Senior Officer Commander Cyril Simard toured the defensive installations one final time. The atoll's two modest islands now brimmed with ammunition, fuel supplies, and planes. A single perfectly aimed bomb could transform the entire facility into an inferno, yet retreat wasn't possible. Everything hinged on Midway's resilience as naval forces prepared to engage the adversary. When darkness descended on June 3, 1942, American PBY Catalinas launched from Midway, spreading across the ocean in extended search formations. These sluggish, bulky aircraft would be first to encounter the approaching enemy. Their aviators recognized that locating the Japanese fleet meant near-certain death, as these slow planes made simple targets for Zero fighters, but discovering the enemy's location justified the price. At 0900 on June 3, Ensign Jack Reed, maneuvering his PBY, detected vessels breaking the horizon. Sighted main body, he transmitted, bearing 262, distance 700 miles. The Japanese invasion convoy had been discovered, though the carriers remained concealed. That same afternoon, B-17s launched from Midway targeted the invasion group, yet achieved no direct impacts. 4 Catalinas equipped with torpedoes conducted a nocturnal assault, reporting one successful strike. Although these efforts inflicted minimal damage, they conveyed to Japanese commanders that the Americans anticipated their arrival. At 0300 on June 4, general quarters sounded throughout American carriers. Pilots gathered for final instructions and composed messages to loved ones. Technicians completed last-minute inspections of their aircraft, while ordnance teams secured bombs and torpedoes into place. Just 230 planes distributed across 3 carriers faced the assembled might of the Japanese Navy. The challenges were formidable, yet American forces held advantages. They were aware the enemy approached, they had pinpointed their location, and they fielded commanders prepared to execute bold maneuvers. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, leading operations from Yorktown, instituted a strategy governing American tactics throughout the engagement. Instead of grouping his carriers together for shared security, he decided to disperse them, minimizing the possibility that all 3 would face destruction simultaneously. The entire campaign represented a calculated risk on an unprecedented scale. With dawn breaking on June 4, 1942, conditions aligned for one of history's most consequential naval engagements. The Japanese advanced with absolute assurance, believing they would surprise the Americans. In reality, they navigated directly into a meticulously designed ambush. The American Navy, weakened yet unbowed following the destruction at Pearl Harbor, stood prepared to demonstrate that American resilience and innovation could triumph despite seemingly insurmountable circumstances. At 0430 hours on June 4, the pre-dawn silence blanketing Midway exploded with the thunder of aircraft engines. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga commanded 108 Japanese planes launched from 4 carriers toward their destination. The strike package comprised 36 attack bombers, equipped with conventional ordnance for ground targets, 36 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters providing protection. As formations took shape in the gathering darkness, none of the Japanese pilots comprehended that American carriers hovered nearby, prepared for action. On Midway, radar technicians registered the approaching assault at 0552. Many planes bearing 320 degrees, distance 93 miles, the operator announced, maintaining composure, though his pulse quickened. Alarm bells pierced the morning air across the atoll. Marines bolted toward their combat positions, while aviators raced to their planes. Every operational aircraft on Midway required immediate launch or face destruction while grounded. Major Lofton Henderson guided Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 toward the brightening sky, piloting his outdated Buffalo fighters and acknowledging he led his men toward slaughter. The Buffalo possessed inferior speed, maneuverability, and firepower compared to the Zero. Yet Henderson's Marines possessed unwavering dedication to defending their base regardless of personal cost. Enemy fighters 12 o'clock high. Radio transmissions crackled with urgent alerts as the Marines engaged the incoming strike force directly. The Zeros descended on American fighters like predators spotting prey. Within moments, the air transformed into a panorama of fire and destruction, American planes burning and plummeting toward water below. Henderson's plane joined those shot down as he directed his dive bombers into their attack. The Marine sacrifice served a purpose. Their assault fractured the Japanese formation and forced bombers into evasive maneuvers. Crucially, it provided precious minutes for Midway's bomber force to depart the island and proceed toward the Japanese fleet, whose coordinates had been radioed by searching Catalinas. At 0630, Tomonaga's formation reached Midway and commenced their bombardment. Ordnance rained across the airfield, fuel reserves, and protective emplacements. Anti-aircraft guns thundered ceaselessly, creating a landscape of dark smoke billowing across the heavens. A strike demolished the power installation, disabling Midway's radar system. Blazing ordnance ignited the fuel containers, pushing massive dark columns upward into morning light. Yet as Tomonaga assessed the devastation from above, disappointment became evident. The initial objective had not been accomplished. The runways bore scarring but remained serviceable. Numerous fortifications persisted intact. Most significantly, comparatively few aircraft had been destroyed on the ground because American pilots had successfully launched their planes to safety. Tomonaga transmitted his assessment back to Admiral Nagumo. A second strike wave is required. This communication initiated decisions that would reshape the conflict's trajectory. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo confronted an agonizing choice. He had preserved 93 aircraft outfitted with anti-ship ordnance, torpedoes and armor-piercing charges, awaiting potential American naval activity. Should he convert them to carry ground attack ordnance for renewed assault on Midway, or maintain readiness for naval engagement? At 07:55, Nagumo announced his consequential determination: rearm the aircraft with bombs for ground assault. Ground crews undertook the exhausting task of extracting torpedoes and substituting conventional bombs. The operation proved hazardous on congested hangar levels, given armed ordnance being transported amid volatile fuel and ammunition supplies. Unbeknownst to Nagumo, 200 miles northeastward, American carriers were dispatching their own assaults. Admiral Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, executed his most consequential decision, releasing all available planes at their maximum operational radius. The move carried tremendous risk. His aircraft would possess barely sufficient fuel for return, yet would locate Japanese forces during their most defenseless period. Pilots, board your aircraft. Commands reverberated across American flight decks. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron piloted Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, comprehending the terrible likelihood facing his slow, fragile Douglas TBD Devastators. During his pre-flight conference, he delivered unvarnished truth to his aviators. If we exhaust our fuel, we'll crash together. Should only a single survivor emerge, he will strike a carrier. May divine protection accompany us all. Among Waldron's aircrew was Ensign George Gay, the young Texan destined to become the sole survivor of his entire squadron. As Gay prepared his Devastator, he examined his radio gunner's station. Radio operator Bob Huntington responded with an encouraging gesture, concealing his own apprehension beneath manufactured courage. By 0800, the American assault launched, but remained fragmented. Individual squadrons diverged amid cloud cover. Each proceeded autonomously toward the anticipated Japanese location. This fragmented approach would represent simultaneously a constraint and paradoxically an asset in the impending battle. Meanwhile, Nagumo's predicament was deteriorating. At 0728, a reconnaissance pilot from Cruiser Tone finally transmitted 10 enemy surface craft bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed 20 knots. The aviator failed to identify vessel classifications, an omission leaving Nagumo uncertain whether he faced carriers or simply surface warships. Terminate the rearming process, Nagumo commanded, yet turmoil consumed the Japanese hangar bays. Certain planes had completed rearming, others remained partially converted, and ordnance lay strewn everywhere throughout the frantic conversion effort. This setback demonstrated tragic consequences. At 0820, the Tone Scout transmitted fresh intelligence that stunned Nagumo. Enemy vessels are accompanied by what looks to be a carrier. The Americans operated carriers, and his own planes existed in disarray, caught between ordnance configurations. Additionally, his initial strike force returned from Midway, starved for fuel and demanding immediate recovery. The opening American strikes originated from Midway-based platforms, Marine dive bombers and Army B-17s descending from altitude. These scattered, uncoordinated assaults registered no direct hits, and Japanese carriers executed successful evasive maneuvers around descending ordnance. Zero fighters decimated Marine aircraft, though each unsuccessful attack necessitated Japanese carrier movements, postponing flight recovery. At Aero 920, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron spotted the Japanese fleet via cloud breaks. His torpedo squadron had isolated itself, having separated from fighter and dive bomber support. Waldron comprehended that attacking absent fighter escort signified certain destruction, but recognized this represented perhaps their single opportunity. Attack without delay, Waldron commanded, guiding his 15 Devastators toward the Japanese carriers at water level. The Zeros anticipated their arrival. As the sluggish torpedo carriers lumbered toward their marks at minimal altitude, Japanese fighters unleashed ferocious strikes. One following another, the Devastators erupted into flame and plunged into salt water. Gay witnessed his fellow aircrews perishing around him in anguish. Waldron's aircraft absorbed damage and twisted downward into ocean. Others detonated in flight or fragmented beneath concentrated assault. Gay maintained his approach, his gunner Huntington discharging rounds at attacking Zeros till Japanese cannon rounds claimed his existence. Gay launched his torpedo at the carrier Soryu, subsequently flying immediately above the vessel at such reduced altitude that Japanese personnel stood plainly discernible. Seconds afterward, his fuselage absorbed countless rounds and descended toward water. Injured though conscious, Gay released his buoyancy device and positioned himself beneath a floating cushion, transforming into an unintended spectator observing the engagement unfold. Torpedo Squadron 8 suffered complete annihilation. All 15 Devastators descended into ocean. Out of 30 personnel, George Gay represented the exclusive survivor. Their torpedoes, compromised by mechanical defects, either diverged from targets or detonated unsuccessfully. The Marines' final act held significance. Their assault scattered Japanese fighter formations and forced bombers into survival maneuvers. Additional American torpedo squadrons appeared and encountered comparable destruction. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 sustained 10 of 14 losses. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 sustained 10 of 12 losses. The outdated Devastators and their unreliable torpedoes seemed to substantiate Japanese conviction of their technological supremacy. Yet the continuous assaults demanded perpetual evasive maneuvers, restricting Nagumo's capacity for launching or retrieving aircraft. By 1020, Japanese carriers existed in disarray. Aircraft returning from Midway circled overhead, gasoline reserves critically depleted. Flight bays overflowed with planes undergoing refueling and rearming procedures. Ordnance scattered across hangar compartments. Fire precautions deteriorated amid the scramble to ready planes for counterattack against American carriers. This instant of greatest vulnerability coincided with Commander Wade McCluskey's emergence overhead, directing 33 dive bombers from Enterprise. McCluskey had navigated his formations through prolonged reconnaissance, pushing beyond margins permitting confident return. When options appeared exhausted, he discovered a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. McCluskey reasoned it steered toward the primary force and adjusted his heading accordingly. At 10:22, McCluskey's persistence manifested reward. Between cloud openings, the Japanese carriers revealed themselves positioned below, with flight decks saturated with aircraft. No Zeros challenged him at altitude. All remained at water level, eliminating final torpedo bombers. McCluskey organized his squadrons, assigning objectives to separate targets, and communicated the mandate countless Americans awaited since Pearl Harbor's destruction. Attack without hesitation. Lieutenant Dick Best steered his formation toward Akagi, Nagumo's command vessel. Pitching into his assault trajectory, Best maintained concentration on the expanding carrier image. At 2,500 feet elevation, Best discharged his 1,000-pound ordnance and executed a sharp extraction. His wingman dropped in right behind him, maintaining perfect formation through the dive. Most of the ordnance fell harmlessly into the ocean, scattered across miles of water. The pilots were running on fumes, their bodies aching from the brutal dive through the flak barrage, but Best's payload found its mark with devastating precision. His bomb tore straight through Akagi's flight deck and detonated deep in the hangar below, where aircraft sat fueled and armed, waiting to launch. The explosion was absolute. Fire consumed everything. Secondary blasts erupted one after another as aviation fuel ignited and ordnance cooked off in a merciless chain reaction that tore the great ship apart from within. Akagi became a burning hellscape within moments. But Best wasn't alone. McCluskey's other squadron bore down on Kaga simultaneously, and their bombs scored at least 4 solid hits. The Japanese carrier became a torch, packed as it was with fully prepared aircraft ready for battle. And then, almost at the exact same instant, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers descended on Soryu in a picture-perfect textbook assault. 3 direct hits turned her into an inferno as well. 6 minutes. That's all it took. 3 of Japan's most powerful carriers, the backbone of their striking force, were transformed from ships of war into burning coffins. From his precarious position in the water, clinging to wreckage, Ensign George Gay bore witness to the impossible unfolding before his eyes. The carriers that had seemed untouchable mere heartbeats ago were now raging fires against the bright Pacific sky. Japanese sailors jumped and fell into the oily water below, their bodies silhouetted against the flames as they fled the inferno above them. The bodies of his fellow pilots floated around him in the water, but their deaths had purchased this moment of triumph. Admiral Nagumo found himself forced to evacuate the doomed Akagi, transferring his command flag to a waiting cruiser as the carrier became engulfed in flames around him. He stood in shock, watching 3/4 of his entire striking force cease to exist in what felt like minutes. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were gone. The battle was far from over, though. Hiryu remained operational, racing northwest in desperate flight, while her pilots launched one final counterattack, determined to strike back before the end came. The mystique of Japanese naval invincibility, forged through 6 months of consecutive victories, lay shattered on the ocean floor. But the war continued on. Hiryu's attack found Yorktown early that afternoon, and the American carrier faced her supreme trial. Despite the fierce defense put up by her fighter pilots and the wall of anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky, Japanese dive bombers penetrated the defensive screen and scored 3 hits that set the ship ablaze and tilted her dangerously to one side. The sailors working damage control fought with superhuman effort to save her, and for a time it seemed their desperate struggle might succeed. Then, in a crushing blow, torpedo bombers appeared and put 2 more fish into her hull. Admiral Fletcher made his way to a cruiser to transfer command to Spruance. The crew abandoned the listing carrier, but Yorktown proved too tough to finish. She floated defiantly until June 7th, when Japanese submarine I-168 discovered her wallowing in the sea and sent 2 torpedoes into her side, finally sending her down to join the carrier graveyard on the ocean floor. Yorktown's loss cut deep into American hearts, yet by that time Hiryu had already followed her sisters into the abyss. Late on June 4th, Enterprise dive bombers located the last Japanese carrier still afloat and left her completely engulfed in flame from bow to stern. 4 fleet carriers, the very ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, now rested at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. As night descended on June 4th, exhausted American pilots returned to their ships, many with fuel gauges showing empty or nearly so. Damaged planes and aircraft running on fumes ditched into the darkening sea. Destroyers raced through the blackness, plucking survivors from the water and pulling them aboard. The price in lives had been substantial, but the strategic outcome could not be questioned. Any pursuit was resisted by Admiral Spruance, who refused to be tempted into chasing the fleeing Japanese fleet. He understood that somewhere in the darkness, Yamamoto's battleships were waiting, and his own pilots could barely keep their eyes open, let alone fly another mission. Preserving the victory he held in his hands mattered far more than attempting something that could end in catastrophe. Others questioned his caution, but events proved him right. When dawn broke on June 5th, American search planes found only burning wreckage scattered across empty ocean where the Japanese fleet had been. A few desperate attacks came from Japanese cruisers and from aircraft salvaged from the crippled carriers before they sank. But these final efforts accomplished nothing. Over the following days, American forces continued attacking the retreating Japanese armada, sinking the heavy cruiser Mogami and damaging numerous other vessels. The final tally was staggering. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 sailors, many of them veterans with years of combat flying behind them. America had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 147 aircraft, and 362 men. Statistics, however, reveal only part of the reality. Japan's capacity to wage offensive war in the Pacific had been permanently shattered. The initiative in the Pacific War now belonged to America. Both sides struggled to comprehend what had occurred. For Americans, the victory vindicated their reliance on intelligence and their willingness to accept calculated risks when the stakes demanded it. Nimitz's faith in his codebreakers, Spruance's disciplined tactical leadership, and the raw courage displayed by American pilots had somehow produced a miracle. For Japan, Midway represented a catastrophic reversal that exposed serious weaknesses in their strategic thinking. Their belief in their own superiority, their overly complicated operational plan that scattered their forces, their failure to maintain adequate reconnaissance for American carriers, and those critical minutes when their ships sat defenseless during aircraft rearming, all of these had converged to create disaster. Yet the torpedo bomber crews deserved special acknowledgement for their sacrifice. Their attacks, though many saw no direct success, disrupted Japanese operations and forced the defending fighters down from altitude. John Waldron and pilots like him had known with certainty they were flying to almost certain death, yet they pressed forward anyway. News of the victory electrified America. After 6 months of losses and retreats, the nation had finally won a major victory over Japan. The path to Tokyo would demand terrible sacrifice and years of brutal fighting, but Midway demonstrated the journey could be made. The Japanese Navy, dominant since Pearl Harbor, had been defeated by a smaller American force. Japan's government carefully concealed the extent of the catastrophe from its people. Sailors returning from Midway were restricted and isolated so word would not spread. The official narrative proclaimed a glorious victory, but Navy officers knew the bitter truth. The offensive era of Japan's war had ended. From this moment forward, they would defend what they had taken against an ever-strengthening American tide. Midway became the turning point, not merely of the Pacific War, but of world history itself. It demonstrated that intelligence, properly employed, could overcome numerical disadvantage. It proved that sacrifice and courage, even in apparent failure, could open doors to victory. Most crucially, it showed the United States possessed both the will and the means to defeat even the mightiest opponent. In his after-action report, Admiral Nimitz gave recognition to the codebreakers who had unraveled Japanese plans, to the commanders who had made split-second decisions under pressure, and especially to the pilots who had attacked through overwhelming odds. Yet he also acknowledged the hand of fortune in warfare. Should those American dive bombers have arrived 5 minutes later, after the Japanese had already launched their counterattack, the entire battle could have turned against America. The 4 carriers Japan lost at Midway could never truly be replaced. The years of construction and the decades of pilot training represented by those ships could not be duplicated. New carriers would eventually join the Japanese fleet, but the particular mix of ships, experienced air crews, and trained pilots that had powered their victories could never be reconstituted. For young American pilots who walked away from Midway alive, the battle became unforgettable. Dick Best, who released the bomb that sealed Akagi's fate, would continue flying combat missions, but no moment would approach the intensity of those minutes above the Japanese fleet. Others, like Ensign Gay, would spend the remainder of their days carrying memories of friends lost over those waters. The battle also revolutionized naval warfare itself. For the first time, opposing fleets had fought entirely through aircraft without ever sighting each other. The battleship's age of dominance was concluding. The aircraft carrier had become the supreme weapon at sea. In the larger sweep of World War II, Midway served as America's Stalingrad, the moment when an apparently unstoppable advance halted and reversed direction. Combined with the grinding struggle at Guadalcanal that followed, it marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat back across the Pacific. American industry, now fully mobilized for war, would manufacture ships and aircraft in volumes Japan could never approach. Veterans of Midway would advance through the Solomon Islands, across the Philippines, and eventually stand at Japan's doorstep. They had learned the Japanese could be beaten, that American equipment and training, when properly utilized, could match or exceed enemy ability and resolve. For Japan, Midway exposed a fundamental flaw in their entire strategic conception. They had begun a war against a nation with 10 times their industrial output, believing spiritual superiority could overcome material reality. The Americans demonstrated at Midway that they possessed both material strength and the determination to employ it ruthlessly. The code breakers who made victory possible received scant public acknowledgement during wartime. Their work stayed classified for decades afterward. Yet officers like Lieutenant Commander Rush Hart and his colleagues had arguably achieved the most significant intelligence triumph in American history. By breaking the Japanese code and predicting their movements, they had provided Nimitz the precise intelligence he needed to position his carriers perfectly. Hart himself, despite his central role, would be reassigned not long after Midway due to disputes with Washington bureaucrats. His team's achievements had demonstrated intelligence could determine battles, but internal rivalries prevented proper recognition until decades had passed. Posthumously, in 1986, he received the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. Over the years, Midway acquired an almost legendary quality in American military consciousness. It became the classic example of how intelligence, bravery, and tactical competence could overcome superior opposition. Military academies everywhere analyzed the battle, searching to understand how Americans had engineered such a complete reversal. The personal stories matter as much as the strategies. Behind every tactical decision were individual moments of heroism that shaped the outcome. Marine pilots flew aging fighters against the latest Japanese aircraft. Torpedo bomber crews attacked without fighter escort. Dive bomber pilots searched beyond their fuel safety limits. Damage control sailors saved vessels that should have sunk. Each person's contribution, no matter how small, helped create victory. Japanese pilots and sailors showed equal bravery despite their catastrophe. Many chose death rather than surrender, going down with their ships or flying damaged planes into the ocean. Their courage, though in a losing cause, reflected the warrior code that had made them formidable enemies. Both navies would extract lessons from Midway. Americans refined their carrier tactics, developed superior aircraft, and created better torpedoes. Japan struggled to rebuild her carrier forces and train replacement pilots for those lost. Yet no lesson could reverse the fundamental shift in momentum. American production would soon flood the Pacific with an unstoppable wave of new ships and planes, while Japan's resources steadily declined. Midway stands as one of history's most consequential naval battles. In a handful of minutes on June 4, 1942, the entire trajectory of the Pacific War shifted. American dive bombers arrived at the perfect moment and found Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable. The destruction that followed ended Japan's ability to wage offensive war and commenced America's long drive westward across the Pacific. Today, Midway Atoll is a wildlife sanctuary, its runways silent and structures decaying. Yet the waters surrounding it remain sacred ground, hallowed by the blood of brave men from both nations who fought and fell in a battle that transformed history. Their sacrifice teaches us that freedom demands constant vigilance, that intelligence and preparation can conquer overwhelming obstacles, and that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary deeds when their nation's survival hangs in balance. Midway's influence persists in how the modern American Navy emphasizes intelligence, carrier aviation, and adaptive tactics. It proved naval warfare had entered a new era where information mattered as much as firepower, where aircraft could destroy the largest battleships, and where triumph belonged to those who adapted fastest to changing conditions. These principles guide naval strategy still. When we remember Midway, we honor the victory and the men who secured it. From Admiral Nimitz directing strategy from Pearl Harbor to Ensign Gay floating in the ocean, witnessing his sacrifice bear fruit, every participant played a vital role. Their combined actions transformed what could have been defeat into decisive triumph, altered history's course, and showed that free peoples unified in purpose can overcome any obstacle. Midway transcended military victory. It represented intelligence, conquering ignorance, preparation, defeating complacency, and courage overpowering fear. It demonstrated America possessed the capacity and resolve to wage global war and prevail. Ultimately, it proved the ideals of democracy and freedom, defended by brave men and women, could triumph against tyranny and conquest. That truth, learned in the waters surrounding a remote atoll in June 1942, speaks as powerfully today as it did when those brave sailors and pilots fought their battle in the vast Pacific sky.